Welcome to today's catalytic conversation on balancing work and care, strategies for meaningful employment. My name is Jackie Eels, and I'm a research manager in the Department of Human Ecology at the University of Alberta. I'm delighted and honored to moderate this catalytic conversation hosted by Carers Canada, a priority program of the Canadian Home Care Association, and AgeWell, Canada's Technology and Aging Network. We have people from across Canada joining us virtually. We begin today by acknowledging the land for this place known as Canada. We recognize with humility and gratitude that Canada is located in the traditional, historical, and ceded and unceded lands of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples. On behalf of us all, we acknowledge and pay respect to the Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, who continue to work, educate, and contribute to the strength of this country. Today is National Caregivers Day, a day to set aside to recognize the 8 million caregivers in Canada, people who assist family members and friends who have chronic health conditions, disabilities, or functional limitations. Caregiving is not only about doing tasks, but it's also about being in relationships with people, not only the care receiver, but other family members and friends as well. Caregivers are dedicated Canadians who make extraordinary contributions to the very fabric of our country. Collectively, they provide 5.7 billion hours of care per year at an estimated economic value of $97.1 billion. It would take the equivalent of 2.8 million full-time workers to replace the unpaid hours that family caregivers provide. In that spirit of recognizing and celebrating the contributions of family caregivers, we have assembled an extraordinary panel of Canadians who know family caregiving well, particularly the demands it places on caregivers who are also working in the paid labor force. Caregiving has touched each of their lives, both personally and professionally. It is my absolute delight to welcome to the panel today, Wendy Moyle, a family caregiver with experience as both an employee and small business owner, Kenya Kondo, co-founder of mymatchwork.com, Frank Monteleone, Chief People Officer and President of Rexel Care Network, and Janet Fast, Professor in the Department of Human Ecology at the University of Alberta and AgeWell researcher. They will share their stories and experiences, their wisdom and insights about balancing work and care, and the challenges and solutions of making care work and paid work sustainable for employed caregivers and their employers. They will speak frankly about what's working and what's not. They are committed to providing you with information you can apply, insights you can consider, and inspiration to help you move forward. I invite you to engage with us in the chat box by sharing your experiences and answering some of the questions that will be raised by our two chat moderators. Andrew Magnai, a doctoral student in the Department of Human Ecology at the University of Alberta, and Darina Semenov, Senior Manager, Policy and Knowledge Mobilization with AgeWell. You can also engage with us on social media all through the day. This presentation will be recorded and made available on AgeWell's YouTube channel following the event, as well as the Carers Canada website. We plan to have a short question and answer period at the end, so please use the Q&A feature as we go to ask questions and let us know which panel member your question is directed to. We're going to start first by asking our audience a poll question. So looking back on your life, have you ever been a family friend caregiver and worked at a paid job at the same time? Yes or no? Has everyone had a chance? Are things still coming in, Darina?
Yep, just a few. It's mostly yes. 77% yes.
Wow, that's not surprising. The 2022 National Caregiver Day campaign focuses on balancing paid work and care work. Like the audience, where we've got 77% has had the experience of balancing paid work and care work. When we look at Canada overall, approximately 1 in 3 people in the labor force are caregivers, or an estimated 5.2 million employed Canadians between the ages of 19 and 70 who combine paid work with some level of unpaid care work. And most of these individuals have full-time jobs. The 2022 National Caregiver Day campaign is dedicated to recognizing and celebrating these hardworking individuals just like you, amplifying their voices and experiences, and highlighting ways in which organizations can support them. I know that each of our panel members have personal experiences with paid work and care work. So to get this catalytic conversation started, I'm going to start first with Wendy. What does work and care mean to you?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much, Jackie, for allowing me to be a member. Very honored to be part of this Caregiving National Caregivers Day today. Looking back, I recognize now that my caregiving journey started at a very young age in my childhood. My mom had a very long history of health issues, and my dad heart issues and heart attack when I was 17. As the only girl in my family, there was a certain expectation placed on me to take care of my parents' needs, to take care of everything. I married at a very young age of 21, and within 3 years, my husband at an age of 24 was diagnosed with cancer. We also had a baby born very premature within that year prior to his cancer diagnosis, which required a great deal of care for a great deal of time. As a daughter, a wife, and a mother, and a full-time employee, life just went on. Self-care just was not part of the plan. I did whatever I had to do to deal with it, which many of us caregivers do. Working a full-time job in the banking industry is where I was, and providing care for my family and parents now just became a norm in my life. Even while I was working at the bank, I was always taking care of people, so it was pretty much my DNA, my purpose. I worked in the industry for 33 years, but as my parents grew older, life went on. My parents' needs became more required, and working care became extremely challenging for me. I was in the leadership position, so expectations were very demanding of me. So I had the demands at every part of my life. Eventually, I left the financial security I had in my job for that 33 years in the corporate world to have more flexibility as an entrepreneur.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you.
Janet, what does work and care mean to you?
Sorry, almost forgot to unmute myself. Well, from a personal perspective, for me, it meant trying to support my parents as they grew older in a different province. I was trying to establish my career at the university in Edmonton, and my parents were living in Vancouver. So, and this was relatively early in my career, so I was still trying to kind of get myself established. But at the same time, I was one of the lucky ones because I had a job that was relatively flexible. I had to be in the classroom at certain times, and I had certain meetings I had to attend to, but but beyond that, I had a lot more control over how I spent the rest of my time. So I had that kind of flexibility that many people don't have the advantage of having. So so I could take weekends, and I could take other breaks in the term to go and help and set up services that they needed and those sorts of things. At least until my mom passed away, and my dad's dementias got worse, and then I had to move him to Edmonton because I didn't have the option of quitting my job. I was the only earner, and I had to support myself, and I had to support him to some extent as well. And so I moved him out to Edmonton to a long-term care facility, which he hated, and which of course then made me feel guilty. But it was something I had to do in order not to give up my job.
Kenya, what does working care mean to you?
Thanks, Jackie, for that question. You know, it is interesting. When we started this project with you and Janet about 2 years ago, I've shared this story many times. The term caregiver didn't really resonate with me, but my whole life I've been a caregiver, and it's from the cultural background I come from. Your parents hit a certain age, it's the thing you do. They need more help, you know, as they get more physically challenged, there's issues there. It's just your role as the son or daughter to provide care to them. And it really wasn't until this project that I realized that I fit the definition of a caregiver. I had a stereotype of what I thought a caregiver was. I didn't realize that I actually was one. And so in the chat, someone mentioned this idea of a sandwich generation. So my wife and I have got 3 children. We've always known that's our responsibility to provide care to them. What we didn't factor in was that we'd also be caregiving to our older parents as they get elderly and they've got issues and challenges. So with this project, what I did was to change my frame of reference about what does caregiving mean and how does it impact people like us who are working full time and then also providing caregiving responsibilities. Our mission is always to connect people to meaningful work. I didn't realize as we were working on this project with you that we would also be solving the problem for ourselves. So for me, what it looks like is my mom is in a different country in Kenya. I'm here in Canada. My brother's in Australia. And my mom is at an age where there's a lot of medical issues. And if we needed to help her out, it's a long way to go. So that's time out to get there, time away from our families, time away from our work and responsibilities. And the pandemic obviously made that much harder to accomplish. So for us, it's trying to find ways to bridge those gaps when we can't be there in person on a weekly or daily basis, leveraging technology where we can, and then leveraging our broader support network back home.
Thank you. Frank, what does working care mean to you?
Thank you, Jackie, and good afternoon, everyone. For me, working care was highlighted at a very early age, actually through very early childhood experience. Similar to Kenya in my culture as well, I'm Italian. As your parents age, as they grow older, they often come to live with you in your house. And that was the case in my household growing up. There was no such thing those days as being labeled or called a caregiver. And my mom took care of all of us. I'm the oldest of 3 children. Then there's my father. And then her parents came to live with us too. And my mom also worked at a bank part-time. And I remember one day, I was playing, doing my own things. And then my mom had to make a phone call. And in those days, if you recall, there were no such things as cell phones or cordless phones. You had one phone in the kitchen, nailed to the wall, or it was screwed into the wall. And she actually had to call her employer and let them know she wasn't coming to work because her mother was sick. And she had no privacy for that phone call. And I was really young, but I remember that phone call today, and it was not a pleasant phone call. And she had to tell her manager why she wasn't coming, and it didn't go so well. And that stuck with me. And if you're a caregiver, you're often pulled in 5 different directions at the same time. And my mom was one of those people. She had to take care of us. She had to take care of her aging parents. She had a job to take care of. She also had my father to take care of. He's not the most domestic individual and still isn't to this day. And, you know, people often think caregiving is just a part of life, but they don't realize that they're in a caregiving situation until it actually hits them in the head and they're in the thick of it. And then they're feeling overwhelmed and they don't know what to do. So.
Yeah. Thank you. To each of our panelists, I really appreciate your openness in sharing your personal stories of working care. Your stories show that caregiving is not only a common experience at any age across the life course, but also that working care looks different to different caregivers. There are a variety of ways in which employment is impacted because of caregiving. So I want to engage our audience again particularly those 77% who said that they have experience with work and care in their past, to learn how caregiving has impacted their paid work, before hearing from Janet about what the latest Canadian research tells us about the sometimes dire consequences that caregiving can have on caregivers' employment. So the poll question is, looking back across your life, how has caregiving impacted your paid work? There are 7 options listed. Select all that apply. My caregiving has not negatively impacted my paid work. I've been distracted at work or unable to concentrate because of my caregiving. I've missed part or full days of work. I've reduced my paid work hours. I've turned down training or job opportunities. I've retired early, quit, or was fired from a job because of my caregiving, or I'm unable to work because caregiving prevents me from working at a paid job. So we'll give a few minutes for our audience to answer those questions before we turn to Janet. I'll start with a brief introduction of Janet as the numbers are coming in. Janet, you're a family economist, and you've spent most of your career interrogating the intersection between paid work and family care work, documenting the consequences and debating its sustainability. As someone who has studied family caregiving and its impact on families for nearly 3 decades, how representative are the employment consequences experienced by our audience members when we compare them to national survey data? So lots of distractions, lots of absenteeism, turning down training and job opportunities, a few retiring early, quitting or fired, some unable to work because of caregiving, and some fortunate who were not negatively impacted by paid work. Janet, can you comment on what the national research tells us about the challenges caregivers face in balancing paid work and care work, and who is at greatest risk?
Sure, thanks, Jackie. Yeah, the personal stories that we heard and the responses that we received from our participants, I think are all too familiar. We've been studying Statistics Canada's national survey data on caregiving since they first began collecting it back in the 1980s. And most recently, the 2018 survey. And our findings are very are resonating a lot with what we've been hearing already in this webinar. The new data, and these findings are literally hot off the presses, by the way, it basically tells us that the story has, the core of the story has remained pretty similar across the last 25 years or so that I've been doing this research. Caregivers do a lot. They do it willingly, and they find it rewarding, but many do it at great cost to their own health, their relationships, their careers, and their financial situations. And that's despite some changes that we've seen, policy changes that we've seen over the last few years. But things are evolving as well, and we've been drilling down more into the data as we become more familiar with what's going on and more familiar with the data. And we find, for example, that caregivers are spending more time on average on their care work, 10 hours a week for men now and 14 hours a week for women, on top of their paid work. So these are all employed caregivers. That's almost 2 extra work days a week for women. And Jackie, you gave us the big numbers for the whole population of caregivers earlier. But if we look just at the employed caregivers in that sample, we find that collectively they spent 3 million of those hours providing care, and we found that it would take about 1.5 million full-time paid care workers to replace all of that work that family caregivers do. And if you multiply that by $17, which is the national median hourly wage for home support workers, you get a staggering $51.5 billion as an estimate of what it would cost to replace that work. We also know that the employment consequences that others just described are common as well, and that those things affect caregivers' financial security. Having difficulty concentrating or fulfilling work responsibilities because of family care is common. So, and that's what in the human resource management literature is referred to as presenteeism. And Frank shared with us his recollection of his mother calling her employer to say that she wouldn't be at work that day because she had to care for his grandmother. Well, in 2018, half of employed caregivers reported that they had to do the same, that they missed an average of 8 hours of a year because of their caregiving responsibility. Collectively, that adds up to 15 million days of absenteeism because of caregiving in a single year. According to Statistics Canada, that's the bulk of all of the absenteeism that's reported in both the private and public sectors in the labor force. So it accounts for a lot of losses to not just to caregivers, but to their employers as well, and to the labor market. Caregivers use their own sick days. They use their holidays. They also cut back on their hours. 1 in 7 employed caregivers cut back on their hours of paid work. And Wendy told us about having to leave her job at the bank. Well, in 2018, more than 200,000 caregivers had to do the same. And obviously those things have a big impact on caregivers' own financial well-being, their income, their benefits, and those sorts of things. But it also increases cost to employers who have to replace them. And it also reduces government revenues, tax revenues. The caregivers who are at the biggest risk of those big ticket employment consequences include those who live with their care receiver, those who are providing lots of care, 20 or more hours a week, and those who are caring for someone with cognitive dementia, and women caring for a spouse or partner. So lots of important consequences with big financial implications for caregivers, their employers, and for society in the form of lost tax revenues.
Very interesting. Thank you, Janet. While national survey data can provide essential evidence for advocacy and an evidence-informed decision-making, it's not the whole picture. Stories deepen our understanding of the nuances of balancing paid work and care work. Wendy, how did caregiving shape your career trajectory, particularly as it relates to your experiences of balance? Wendy, you're on mute.
Thank you, Jackie, for asking that question. Sorry, everybody, for being on mute there. Yeah, it definitely did. Caregiving did shape my career to the point where it influenced me to change my career, as I mentioned before. And it was, I didn't have to. I made that decision to try to find that balance because the caregiving, I'm very, in my DNA, I think, is to care at the highest level I possibly can. It was very much a challenge for me to find that balance. So that decision, eventually, the work and care, it just became too much for me. Very, very overwhelming. And that's when I decided to leave my career midlife to immerse myself in the caregiving space, since that was the space I was spending a lot of time on. And that, frankly, was more important to me. I had to prioritize at this point. I had no choice but to prioritize. But that decision meant that I would be giving up the financial security that I've built since I was 19 years old. I started on my 19th birthday with the bank. So that was scary for me. And when I joined there, it affected, that decision would affect my retirement years as well too. And that was a focus of mine. There was a great deal of financial risk I felt for myself. But again, on the other hand, it was almost like you say, a no-brainer decision for me. I had to do what I had to do. That's when I started Wendy's Errands for Elders. I applied my banking knowledge, the business knowledge of working with the entrepreneurs to become one, and hoping that this would give me greater flexibility to be there for my parents. My mom had now been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, so it just really kept shaping of where I was going. And she suffered a stroke in late of 2018, which left her now paralyzed on left side of her body. So things just escalated more and more. And we had no choice but to have her to go live in a long-term care facility. And at the same time, my dad went into congestive heart failure and passed away within that year. I realize there are many caregivers struggling, as my story is, with that balance. So I created my business to meet their needs based on, to start with, my own life experience, balancing work and care and support that to help them. My parents have both now passed, and at the time my business provided me the flexibility to advocate at a very high level for their needs. But at the same time, there was another flip side to that coin. It did provide the challenge of not being able to focus on my business to expand it. As I continued my work throughout the pandemic, I noticed more and more families out there looking for community resources. Looking back over the last few years with the support of Caregivers Alberta, which I'm very involved in, and giving back to the community, and now am a board member, I realized in hindsight that I had minimal balance or boundaries, which are essential in being a caregiver. Caregiver has to identify healthy boundaries, and we cannot always do this when we're in a reactive state. Boundaries contribute to work and care as they help to establish realistic goals and expectations for both yourself, or what you expect of yourself, and understand in addition to those around you, whether it be working relationship, friendship, or family. Healthy boundaries are necessary components for self-care.
Thanks, Wendy. Based on your experiences, Wendy, it sounds like the notion of balancing work and care is a bit of a misnomer. In fact, women face greater pressures to balance both family and work responsibilities because of gender roles. And like you, women caregivers are more likely to adjust their careers to meet their caregiving duties. As Janet mentioned, the average employed caregiver is spending 10 to 14 hours per week providing care on top of their regular and often full-time work hours, leaving little time for other social and self-care activities. So the struggle to juggle care work and paid work is real. And in your case, Wendy, and in the case of thousands of working caregivers, something had to give. Frank, as the Chief People Officer and President of Rexel Care Network, what are your views on balancing work and care, and how are you supporting family caregivers in the community?
Yeah, that's a great question. First, I'll start by saying, in my own view, I don't think that there is such a thing as balance. To me, balance implies equal, and I don't think that's realistic. Work and care, or work in everyday life, they're intersected. And the reality of our situation is people need to learn how to integrate or intersect work in their personal life, especially over the last couple of years when our homes became our workplaces at the same time. The Rexel Care Network is only a few years old. It was established in 2019, and it was a rebranding of the former Rexel Foundation. And when we were searching for what our new corporate social responsibility cause was, we went to our over 8,000 employees and asked them, what should our cause be? And we put a few causes out there, but the overwhelming cause that we got back that our employees wanted to get behind was unpaid caregiving. And we listened and we moved forward with that. And our mission at the Rexel Care Network is to take care of unpaid caregivers so they can continue to take care of those that they love. For us, it was a matter of finding a cause that was tied to our organizational strategy. It was a matter of finding a cause that we believed in. And then from there, it kind of took off. You know, we had a very large employee base of our current employees who are caregivers. And it also helped attract and retain new employees. And, you know, we're finding that in this day and age of the great attrition, having a corporate social responsibility cause that resonates with people really does help. You know, the Rexel Care Network, you know, what we do for those of you that are unfamiliar with us is we care for caregivers' health and well-being by empowering them with information and community resources, and by giving funding to organizations that provide caregivers with direct support and assistance. And like I said, it's only been the last few years, but we've had a very successful launch, and we look forward to seeing what we can do in the coming years, because this is a very growing segment, and it's something that's very near and dear to many people's hearts, as we're hearing today.
I agree. And we look forward to hearing more examples of how you're making a difference with your own employees a bit later on in the webinar. According to Janet's latest research, of those caregivers of employment age who were not working at the time of the 2018 StatCan survey, 1 in 5 said that caregiving prevented them from working at a paid job. Other caregivers who leave the labor force to provide care sometimes find themselves needing to re-enter the paid labor force after their caregiving journey ends for financial reasons, paying down debt, saving for their own retirement. Kenya, you are one of 3 co-founders of mymatchwork.com, a startup based in Alberta that uses groundbreaking technology to help job seekers find meaningful work and help employers find the right job seekers. You built your cloud-based software platform from the ground up, working with people who are often marginalized from labor force participation, people with disabilities, people who are newcomers to Canada, and pregnant and parenting teens. As you mentioned earlier, with funding from AgeWell, you are currently working with Janet and community organizations, including CARES Canada and Caregivers Alberta, to expand your focus to include family caregivers. Kenya, I'm curious, why did you start with vulnerable workers? What have you learned through the platform development process, working with employment support agencies that serve them? And how can these key learnings be applied to caregivers, particularly with the changing nature of work?
Thanks for that question, Jackie. I think if you look back on my life, there's a lot of happy accidents, as I like to call it. It looks from the outside that I have it planned out, but it doesn't happen that way. So the reason we started Matchwork and the reason we focused on marginalized and vulnerable populations was because of a chance meeting between myself and my 2 co-founders, Karen and Brooks. When we first met, we were all working on different things in different segments, but Karen and Brooks work primarily in the nonprofit sector. And one of the challenges they kept seeing was organizations that were helping vulnerable populations, marginalized people, find and keep meaningful work. But their frustration was it was really time intensive, really manual. And a lot of the solutions they were trying were not geared towards this particular population. And so when we first met, that's when the idea of, well, I think from my perspective, there's could be a role for technology to help solve some of these challenges and problems. And that's why we got into this space. And I think one of the things we've learned along our journey, which has been about 3 years now, is as soon as you put labels, so disabled, language barrier, refugee, newcomer, teen pregnancy, any of those labels, and you start trying to engage employers, there's almost that's a nice thing that you're doing. It's good that we're supporting them, but it doesn't really resonate with employers. And so we find that the value of Matchwork is, we've talked a lot about stories here. And for everyone, the stories are important in terms of us connecting to the problem and ultimately to the solution. But for employers and industry, you also need the data to ground that story. So I'm sure Frank has probably tested a ton of tools and platforms, and so have organizations in the nonprofit sector. And the challenge there is, how do you bring in the human element and aspect towards connecting people to meaningful work? So Matchwork is trying to say that for each person, they are unique. The resume, cover letter, those things are still core and part of parcel of the value they give to an employer. But there's certain elements about people's life in terms of situation, circumstance, their personal goals, ambitions, that really then define what is meaningful work for each person, and ultimately for the employer, there's value. So when you look at caregivers, we've looked at data with you folks at the U of A, with all our research partners here in this Age Well project. And you learned that one of the most important things beyond obvious things like income and benefits for unpaid caregivers was having this sense of identity. So often, I think for a lot of folks perhaps on this call, there's this hiding, or your identity gets blurred between being able to provide for your family, being able to look after your family, but having little room for yourself to look after yourself. And in that sense, you feel the sense of being lost. You don't know who you are, what you're doing. And that came out in the data. That's one of those core drivers. Another driver was the need to be able to socially engage with other people in a work context outside the house. And it's a very weird concept that we came to understand, this idea of work being respite. I think most people think of work as being a chore, something you have to do, you have to bear, and you can't wait till the weekend. But there's a whole group of people who work is that escape for them, their chance to do something other than give of themselves, take away from themselves. And ultimately, this idea that they can feel part of something bigger than themselves, part of something bigger than just their caregiving responsibilities. And so we go from stories, now we've got data to anchor that. And ultimately, the goal with this project we're doing with you, Jackie and Janet and the others on the project is, can we approach employers and industry associations to say, these people have value for you, and here's the data to illustrate that value, and then here are the action points you can take to engage them. So ultimately, you're both benefiting from that. I think one of the good things from the pandemic, ironically, was we were all, for the most part, if you're in a desk type of job, forced to work from home. And employers almost had no choice in that for the most part. But what they saw was the value of their employees working remotely and still adding value to the enterprise, to the organization. And so this was a very unique time scaled experiment where there's actually more and more data showing you can have your workers, your employees, your people work away from the office, and it doesn't diminish productivity. In some cases, it actually increases productivity and value to the organization. But on the flip side, we're also hearing these stories of the Great Resignation. And there's a lot of research being done about what's happening here. What does this mean? But the stories that are coming out are people feeling, well, my time is precious. I need to put that time into something that adds value to my life, something that adds meaning to my life. And in some cases, some jobs don't add value to their lives. And so what I think is going to happen is that as more and more of our workforce gets older, employers, industry are going to have a more nuanced discussion with their employees, with their people, about what does exchange of value mean? How do I add value to your life as an employer? And in turn, you add value to my organization as an employee.
Great, thank you, Kenya. So we're halfway through, but more than halfway through our time. So for the next round of questions, if I can ask people to be a bit more concise, that would be helpful to make sure we can get through everything. So clearly the integration of paid work and care work poses a wicked problem, and wicked problems require multi-sector solutions from individuals, employers, healthcare providers, and governments. While we have exceptional data on the impact of caregiving on paid work, caregiving is often viewed by employers as a personal issue. Even if caregiving is on an organization's radar screen, it's usually a very low priority. Most employers tend to approach supporting employed caregivers on an individual case-by-case basis without recognizing that caregiving is a workplace issue, and that this is going to become more so in the future as people live and work longer. Wendy, as an employed caregiver, what support did you seek from your employer, and how did that work for you?
Yeah, very good question, Jackie. And to be quite honest here, I wasn't honest with them, I think, transparent with them, and it didn't work out well for me in any way. And that's why I made the decision that I did too. I think I believe the stigma still does exist out there. You leave your personal life at home and you don't bring it into work, because of course the businesses have their goals and their business goals that they have to. So it's sad that I think that stigma does still exist out there, but it does. So if I had a do-over there, I would definitely be more transparent with them and share what my experience was at home and how they could support me to be that employee and to stay in that employed position. And I think now, as a business owner and a leader in my own business now, I know what it takes to support, that caregiver, and to ask questions and maybe to look for the signs as well too. When they're not feeling comfortable to come to you, maybe sometimes you have to go to them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie.
Yeah, there definitely seems to be tensions between employees' needs and employers' needs. And Janet, I'm wondering what tensions you found in your research between employees with care responsibilities and employers, and what are some innovative ways of strengthening workplace and public policies to better support employed caregivers?
Sorry, I lost my cursor there for a minute.
No worries.
Yeah, we've done interviews with employers as well as currently employed and formerly employed caregivers and employed caregivers. And we found kind of three main areas of tension. One is whether or not, for the caregiver, whether or not to disclose their status as a caregiver to their employer. Another is, caregivers feeling the need to try to do it all, and sometimes failing utterly at that. And then also managing the uncertainty of care. That's a challenge for both caregivers and care receivers, and their employers, but it's also a source of tension. Employed caregivers are afraid that their employer will retaliate or will punish them, penalize them for having these care responsibilities. They've seen coworkers who did disclose their status to their employer abandoned, stigmatized, denied opportunities, and sometimes even fired. Employers, on the other hand, said that they were prepared to support their caregiver employees, but they needed to know that they were a caregiver along, together with their paid jobs in order to provide that support. So there was a direct conflict there between employees' reluctance to disclose their status, but employers needing them to disclose their status if they were to have any hope of supporting them. Employers also talked about first of all, thinking that the flexibility that they provided to all of their employees was sufficient to accommodate any employed caregiver, any caregiver in their workplace. And that just isn't the case, because caregivers' needs are somewhat different than parents' needs. For example, most employers have come to terms with a lot of their employees having parental responsibilities, and the fact that they are required to a large extent to accommodate those because of the maternity and parental leave programs and those things that are legislated. But they didn't seem to understand that the needs of people who are caring for dependent adults were different than their parent employees. So employers also then talked about needing to know what best practices are. So if they're aware that someone has responsibilities as a caregiver, that those responsibilities have the potential to interfere with their paid work in some way, and they're willing to go the extra mile to try to support those people, how do they do that? And there's a real lack of awareness among a lot of employers about what are the best practices. that will help employees in the workplace balance those responsibilities, or at least fulfill to some extent both of those responsibilities. I agree entirely that balance is kind of an elusive objective. Canada's actually pretty fortunate on the kind of employed caregiver side of things, because we have a number of leave programs that allow caregivers to take shorter or longer term leaves from their paid work without jeopardizing their jobs. We have short-term leaves like family responsibility leave, which ranges from 3 to 12 days per year. And that's leave is primarily for, a day or a half a day to take a parent to a medical appointment or something of that sort. But then we have 2 longer leaves of approximately 26 weeks. It varies a little bit by province. That then allows people to take a longer leave to really focus on serious caregiving responsibilities for a period of time, again, with their job protected and with some income replacement by way of the employment insurance program. So in that respect, I think we do quite well, and especially when we compare ourselves to other countries. These leaves are relatively unique, and especially the income replacement part of that. And there's a lot of research out there showing that those kinds of leaves help. We need more evidence about this, but the evidence that we do have is pretty convincing that it helps both the caregiver employee, but it also then helps the employer to hold on to valued employees, and that those employees are in fact more loyal and more committed to that employer because of the support that they've had from them.
Thank you. So far, we've been talking about caregivers' needs in terms of flexibility and other workplace accommodations and support, but we also know that caregivers have strengths. Kenya, can you summarize what skills caregivers can offer employers, and how might this benefit workplaces in the long term?
Thanks, Jackie, for that question. It's a nice segue into the research work we have done with the U of A around this. And very briefly, some of the skills and values they can add to an employee include being resourceful, being able to solve problems, and then bringing in the human element. Because of the very nature of caregiving, it's required of people to have empathy, a sense of connection to others, to understand what is the problem, what are potential solutions. For an employer in an organization that values innovation, that values progress, that's one of those invaluable skill sets. You also find that with caregivers, they tend to be fairly good at managing time and managing themselves. So from an emotional perspective, fairly well balanced, fairly even. And so when you have those roles where they're engaging with partners, with customers, with clients, that idea of being available, being able to figure out solutions, being able to manage outcomes successfully, some of those values they add to the employer. And then ultimately, this comes down to how we relate to one another. And caregivers have that skill set, which is inherent in their roles, that they can then translate into employment situations. But then on the flip side, we hear a lot of conversations from employers and industry about, well, what can we do to support caregivers who we employ right now? And then one thing we found from the research is flexibility. So this idea that with caregiving responsibilities, you don't really have a fixed schedule. If something happens, you have to leave what you're doing to go and look after the person you're providing care for. And what employers can do, or could do if they don't already do this, is to provide more flexible work options. And I spoke briefly about how potentially one of the benefits of the pandemic is employers having more data to trust that if they create a policy around flexible work arrangements, they will still get value rather than value being taken away from them. And then obviously the other things that follow, a decent wage or income, and if you can, benefits as well, can go a long way towards supporting those caregivers who are underemployment.
Great. Thank you, Kenya. We do have exceptional data on the impact of caregiving on paid work in Canada, but raising awareness among employers continues to be a challenge. As an employer champion, Frank, How is the Rexel Care Network supporting its own employees with care responsibilities? And what are some of the benefits that you're seeing by investing in their well-being?
Well, thank you, Jackie. You know, I said earlier that the mission of the Care Network is to take care of unpaid caregivers so they can continue taking care of those that they love. But as an employer, we at Rexel recognize we have to take care of our own employees who are caregivers. And the reality is, in this day and age, as an employer, you need to meet employees where they are at. You know, the challenge is companies don't know how to quantify care, and they're reluctant to get behind caregiving because they don't know what to do with it almost. You know, in my own company, I see the struggles of juggling work and life and with personal life with employees. And as leader, it's made me more empathetic and willing to lead. So when we were establishing our employee practices, you know, I didn't have a lot of budget to do this. I actually didn't get any extra budget, to be quite candid with everybody. But me and my team, we sat down and looked at all the different pieces that we had, and kind of going back to Janet's point about best practices, is we went and pulled all the information we had and all the different programs that we had and assembled it in a very meaningful way to our employees that we can go to them. And we actually put it in a few different buckets: physical, financial, environmental, social, and emotional. And in each of those categories, we have a lot of different programs that we can offer our employees from a caregiver perspective. And, you know, just some examples from a physical perspective, you know, we employ a flexible work hour arrangement within our offices. You know, we want our employees to be available between core hours of 10 and 3, as we call it. But before and after that, do as you wish. If you have caregiving responsibilities before or after school, you don't need to be online. You know, even with now, as more companies are reopening up, you know, and offices are going back, people are going back into the workplace. We're taking a very novel approach to what we call return to office. I hate the term return to work because I don't know about you, but I've never worked so hard other than the last 2 years through COVID. So we're calling it return to office, where gone are the notions where the office is a place where business happens 5 days a week. If you're going to go to the office, it's going to be from a very intentional purpose. You think of the office as more of a collaboration space. The majority of your work can still be done from home. In our stores, we have very flexible hours, so employees can schedule around their different priorities as well if you work in a, you know, retail environment. From a financial perspective, we pulled together our offerings with Sun Life. So we get extremely discounted rates on RRSPs and TFSAs that we offer our employees to take advantage of than if they were to go to a traditional bank. We also promote the caregiver tax credit as well. We don't give information on it. We put the information there. We tell people, go get your own financial advice, but you'd be surprised how many people don't even know that option exists. And then from a social perspective, we encourage our employees to get involved because we push out resources through our Instagram account and through other means as well. And we want to encourage people to take part in community events, to give back to communities that we operate and do business in. And from an emotional perspective, our EAP program is quite robust, and we've actually got discounted rates for mental health providers should someone need those as well. So we didn't do anything new. We just took all the information that we had, took those best practices, bundled it in a very meaningful way to appeal to different folks to come work with us. And we've seen the results organically over the years through our Glassdoor scores going up, through our engagement scores going up. Our retention rates have improved. So, you know, leadership has to get behind it. I'm not a one-person show. I have a whole team behind me. I have colleagues at the executive table that support it as well. And it ties to our strategic direction as an organization. It's not just Frank. I'm not one person. I have a whole team behind me and the support of a great company with my CEO and president and my colleagues around the table and my own team that helps me put this together and the Rexel Care Network board. But you have to have a lot of like-minded people that are willing to get behind this and push this forward. And it's a slow start, but once it gets going, it's like a snowball effect. It starts getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and you see the results culminating. Now we're extremely proud of what we're doing and looking forward to the future. And we hope more employers will start to do the same too.
That's amazing. I really hope more employers reach out to you, Frank, and say, how do you do this? We have reached the rapid fire round of our webinar. I'm cognizant that we've run out of time for questions. So as we wrap up our catalytic conversation today on balancing work and care strategies for meaningful employment, I'd like everyone to imagine the future of work and care 20, 30 years down the road. To our audience members, please participate in this. Write in the chat box your vision of this future by completing the phrase, wouldn't it be great if, while we listen to our panelists' future aspirations, starting with Wendy. Wendy, wouldn't it be great if?
Wouldn't it be great if we all take pride in our caregivers and take part in our expertise and scope to work to empower caregivers so that they have the support they need, but also thrive as individuals. It would be easy for caregivers to access support, a streamlined system, and that caregivers would know where to go for support, and it would be easily accessible. That it would be okay to say you're a caregiver in the workplace, and that it becomes part of the workplace culture, values, and corporate social responsibility, and that the government and the health systems are all part of the solutions too. It's about coming together collaboratively to support the caregiver. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. Kenya, wouldn't it be great if?
Wouldn't it be great if we all could find and keep meaningful work? And from an employer perspective, employee relationship perspective, wouldn't it be great if we move from a transactional approach towards work to more towards a relationship where both sides are getting value and adding value to each other?
Well said. Frank, wouldn't it be great if?
It would be great if organizations got behind caregiving and realize that they can help support it and make life easier for others and have those open conversations so people can bring their whole selves to work.
Last word to you, Janet. Wouldn't it be great if?
It's a bit repetitive, but I think that's why we're all here. Wouldn't it be great for everyone if we organize workplaces and labor policies so that caregivers can in fact keep earning a living alongside their care work as long as possible? And part of that is about moving from a discourse where we talk about family and friend caregiving as supplemental to the formal care system and start talking about it the opposite way, that the formal care system supplements what family caregivers do, because that is the truth of the matter. 80% or more of all of the care that we receive when we need care is provided by family members and friends. It's not the other way around.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to our panel members for sharing your stories, your insights, your experiences on integrating work and care and the technology, program, and policy solutions that better support working caregivers. Thank you to our chat moderators and poll people, Andrew and Dorina, for engaging with our audience. To our participants for enriching the catalytic conversation with your stories, strategies, resources, and aspirations for a brighter future for working caregivers. And to everyone today, I sincerely appreciate your interests, insights, and inspirations about integrating paid work and care work. As we close the chat box, please write one word that describes how you're feeling about this catalytic conversation. As I mentioned before, the recording will be made available on the Age Well YouTube channel and Carers Canada National Caregiver Day campaign page. Carers Canada is hosting another event today on care and work in Canada, reflections, discoveries, and projections at 2:30 Eastern Time, featuring findings and recommendations from a multi-year partnership project focused on improving and optimizing the well-being of employers who are balancing paid work and unpaid caring responsibilities. And last but not least, if you can please complete a short survey, 2-minute survey about this webinar. It will help ensure that we continue to improve Age Well's webinar series. And we really, really appreciate your feedback, your thoughts, your input today, and your participation. Have a great rest of the day, everyone, and happy National Caregivers Day.